Today's presentation will focus on the topic of irrigated forage. This includes both perennials and annuals. There are a few planning and management considerations that certainly need to be taken in account, such things as how are you going to use this within your operation, selecting of the site or pivot or field that will be used. Certainly the forage type and getting it established is very important, as well as the irrigation, fertilizer, grazing management, and lastly, economics. Now, when it comes to irrigated forages, we can either have perennials or usually annuals, double crop annuals. And with the perennials, I'll mostly focus on the cool season perennial grasses, which are most commonly used. Now, of those cool season perennial grasses, the old four-way grass mix here includes some orchard grass, meadow brome, smooth brome, creeping foxtail, and then some alfalfa or other legume is certainly an option to be included in there as well. But this four-way grass mix, it's been around for a number of years, and has shown really good productivity and persistence over time. A number of other species could be included or used, some of the different wheatgrasses. There's a hybrid wheatgrass called New High that also has some good potential. Tall fescue variety here called Tuscany 2 is an endophyte-free fescue that can also work quite well as the hybrid Festulolium. Here's just an example pasture mix. Includes 6 different species: the orchard, Festulolium, tall fescue, meadow brome, smooth brome, creeping foxtail, and a little bit of alfalfa. I've got the pounds per acre of each that could be included in the mixture, as well as the estimated cost per acre, which totals up to about $70 per acre seed cost. One of the reasons really favor mixtures is that they just have the better adaptability to a variety of soils or moisture conditions that you might encounter in a given field. And two, even though these are all cool season species, they have slight differences in their growth patterns across the season. One important point on this too is that some of these species are bunch grasses, which means they grow in a bunch, and others being sod forming that have underground rhizomes that spread. So this can also be very important in terms of having a good solid stand of grasses within there. Establishment is very important. When people encourage people to do a good job of this at the first time, a number of different possibilities when it comes to planting the cool season grasses. Either the spring seeding, roughly a March 20th to mid-April window there. One of the things about the spring seeding is there's often likelihood of having more weeds during that initial establishment phase or months of establishment. The other and preferred approach can be the late summer seeding. Here we list roughly August 10th, September 10th as that window. With that, you want those cool season grasses to reach 4 to 5 inches by the time November or December rolls around and they're getting ready for winter. Then the following spring, they take off quite rapidly, and oftentimes that first year after the fall seeding, you'll have anywhere from 85 to even 90% the production of an established stand. Fertilizer, we recommend soil testing at the beginning just to see exactly where you are. But once we have an established stand, nitrogen is the primary nutrient that we're going to be needing. And we suggest some split applications of that nitrogen with about 50% in the spring, and then a fourth in the summer and a fourth in early fall. If we have some legumes in there, certainly we do need to make some adjustments in terms of the fertilizer that we're using. This graph here shows orchard grass, smooth brome mixture, and they had different rates of nitrogen. And as you can see, at about 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre, pretty well maxed out the response curve for this two-way grass mix. Irrigation, for fully irrigated cool season grass pasture, we're looking at about at least 16 inches of irrigation water. Here in North Platte, though, for example, we average a little over 16 inches for that April through October time period. And with 16 inches of water, we would have our rainfall, and 16 inches of irrigation, we have the 32 inches total water, which is really needed. Now, this graph here, it gives the average monthly precipitation for the Broken Bow area, which we see is at 19.28 inches. That's the blue bars. And then the orange bars represent the estimated crop water use for the cool season grasses. And you can see the difference between the orange and blue bars would be the amount that is suggested to be made up by irrigation. One of the things about the cool season grasses, they do have the most rapid growth during the spring, particularly that month of May. In some studies we had done here in North Platte, we found that for every inch of water, you would be or could be producing 665 pounds of forage in the spring. And then as we get into the midsummer, that July, early August time period, we're down to 257 pounds of forage production for every inch of water, whether it be the rainfall or the irrigation that's applied. So efficiency of these is just much greater in the spring of the year. Now, certainly a lot of different irrigation strategies out there. The first one, of course, is described as full irrigation, showing using about 14 inches across the growing season as needed. But if we looked at limited irrigation option number 2 there, be a case where we're just irrigating in the spring of the year, April, May, and June as needed. We might stop irrigating in July and part of August, then late August or mid-August, start irrigating again to generate some fall growth. And you see in that case, we're only using or down to just about 7 inches of water on average of irrigation water. Now, this approach too will say that 7 inches doesn't mean you're going to get half the amount of forage as if you would have used 14, and so that can be quite a savings there if we're dealing with some limited water. Grazing management is the other very important part of this picture here. If we do have a good stand of perennial cool season grasses and we are fertilizing and irrigating, we want to make sure our grazing management is at the top of its game to really get the most out of it. Typically, the type of production in terms of stocking rates that a good stand of irrigated pasture can carry, I give a range there of 6 to 12 AUMs per acre. But in reality, I think a really good average is about a pair and a quarter for a 5 or 6 month period. So that's roughly 8 to 9 AUMs per acre. Some type of rotational grazing is suggested in terms of trying to more efficiently use that irrigated grass. It's recommended to have at least 5 to 6 pastures or paddocks. Very important point here is that when we are grazing this, we take it down to about a 5 or 6 inch stubble height at the most, and that will allow those grasses to regrow really rapidly. So in that rotation with 5 or 6 pastures, we're looking at roughly a week in each of the pastures and then 28 to 35 day rest period. And as those grasses slow down their growth rate in the summer, the general rule of thumb is that you can typically stay in there longer and then plus give a longer rest period. The growth rate, again, as I mentioned on these cool season grasses, is very rapid during the month of May. In some of our data here, we're showing that we're almost producing 140 pounds of forage per acre per day during that rapid growth period, whereas in the summertime, we may slow down to the having just about 40 pounds of per acre per day growth rate during that hot part of the summer. Some key grazing management principles. I think first is, again, using that rotational grazing approach. This increases our stock density on any given on a per acre basis, and it also improves our grazing distribution and harvest efficiency. Again, another important thing is, again, maintaining that adequate leaf area to increase the rate of regrowth. So that's that 5 or 6 inch stubble height. Some different strategies for using the irrigated pasture course could be season long, and that's typically mid-April where you get to start, and then leave or last to mid-October or even late October. Another approach might be to graze that irrigated grass with pairs, April and May, and then the pairs go to native pasture or range, and then bring in some yearlings or other class of livestock to continue to graze on the irrigated grass. But the third approach here just shows another possibility where the pairs graze that irrigated grass spring and early summer. They go to range, say towards the latter part of July. There's a period where there's no use on the grass, but you're stockpiling or accumulating grass for fall use by weaned calves. A few things on the costs. Here's the establishment cost based on an August seeding and your no-till drillings into some stubble. Again, there's that $70 per acre for the grass seed mixture. Might have to use a burned down herbicide, estimated at $10 per acre. The drilling itself at $14, some starter fertilizer and fall irrigation. That brings up the total to about $130 per acre establishment cost. If we have to do some fencing and livestock water development, here's some estimates here. This can be quite variable, really based on how much you put into the fencing, whether it's, in this case here, having a perimeter fence of a 2-wire high tensile electric plus an energizer. For cross fencing, oftentimes just using one single wire. The livestock water, which includes a tank, hydrant, and some underground piping at $26. So the total is at $116, but this total plus the grass establishment seed costs and such brings the total to $246 per acre. Some annual operating costs. In the example here, we're showing an estimated need of 160 pounds of nitrogen for $72 per acre, 12 inches of irrigation water. We're also charging some maintenance. And then, so that's the total of $164 annual operating cost as far as an estimate. Just some potential returns. Here we've got a table showing that if we valued our grazing on the top part there at $55 per pair per month, and we were able to have a good stand of grass and stock it at a pair and a quarter per acre, graze it for 6 months, that's 11.25 AUMs per acre, or roughly a gross return of about $412 per acre. The bottom part of the table here shows the same thing, but just changing the numbers if we were basing the value of grazing at $45 per pair per month. For more information on the irrigated pasture, the beef.unl.edu website has a series of webinars that a bit more specifically go into detail on each of these topics or phases of irrigated pasture, perennial irrigated pasture management that I briefly talked about. A few things on some of the annual forages. We oftentimes hear these as alternative forages, alternative or forage cocktails, or in some cases cover crops. This concludes a wide variety of species that can be used. I like to break them down by the different times of the year that they're seeded. And in case of the winter annuals or the fall seeded ones, we're of course dealing with things like our winter wheat, rye, triticale, winter barleys, or some annual ryegrasses. One of the things I noticed about these, the spring production of these winter annuals can really vary quite significantly depending on the spring growing conditions in any given year. Just some yield numbers from Triticale and winter rye variety trials that we had done here in North Platte. But you can see in terms of some of these different Triticales in that 4 to 5 tons per acre hay yield versus the common winter rye down here at the bottom at about 3.5. Protein levels of these in that 10 to 12% range. Typically, in terms of our haying on these test plots, we harvest at a similar stage of maturity when they're in the late milk to early soft dough stage. The spring seeded cool season annuals includes things like oats, of course, which is very common, spring triticale and spring barley. Can also be used. Some people include field peas as part of a mixture. There's also several other legumes or ryegrasses that could be included as well. Planting date for these cool season annuals are typically mid-March to mid-April. They can tolerate fairly cool soil temperatures. Seeding rates, certainly check with your seed supplier or extension officers because of the fact that depending on what the species or even some of the varieties that you need would have a little bit more specific requirements in terms of the seeding rates of each of those. Just some photos of some test plots of a number of different cool season spring seeded, March 31st seeded small grain forages. We have on the top left photo some Jerry oats and a VNS spring triticale on the right. On the bottom right photo is some haybat barley and then a spring triticale on the right. Some yields from these. This is for 2015. We also had an everleaf oats in there, but also quite good in the spring yields, 4 to 4.5 or a little over 4.5 tons per acre. And on the average, that was roughly by June 22nd harvest date. Quality of this hay varied a little bit more, 8 to almost 12%. Again, when it comes to the quality, whether it's protein or TDN, that harvest date is very critical in terms of getting it at the right stage if you're looking for the most highest quality forage. The summer or warm season annuals, here we describe these as late spring or summer seeded. This includes millets, both the grazing and hay types. Hay types would be the foxtail millets, such as White Wonder or German, Siberian. There's also the sorghum Sudan grass hybrids, straight sorghum, Sudan grass. Some people have been using crabgrass, teff, other warm season possibilities as well. Similar, so the planting dates on these, mid-May all the way up to August, like those warm soil temperatures. Don't want to get some of these warm season annuals planted too early if those soil temperatures are remaining cooler. In general, for the taller growing things such as the sorghums and Sudan grasses, we're in that 4.5 to 5.5 ton per acre hay yield productivity. Things like the foxtail millet, 2.8 to 3.8 is what I have listed there as far as tons per acre. And teff, roughly 2.6 to 3.8 tons per acre expected hay yields on those. Many of the sorghums and sorghum Sudan grass hybrids, they have the brown midrib or BMR varieties available. And as you can see on the left, that is simply a marker indicating that that plant has been modified where it does have higher digestibility in that plant. And it does make a difference in terms of whether those BMR plants are grazed directly or if they're fed out as hay. Teff has been around for a few years now. It's a warm season, shorter growing species. The feature, one of the key features about teff has been the high quality hay that it makes. And as you can see from the picture, it is very, very fine stems and long leaves. So it just fits, as you would expect, does make very, very good palatable and pretty good quality hay as well. The teff does have a really small or tiny seed, and it does have to be planted relatively shallow on a firm seed bed, and so that can be a little bit tricky sometimes in terms of getting the drill or broadcast equipment adjusted just right. Some results from an older trial here where we had a couple of different varieties of teff, a couple of crabgrass varieties, and then also White Wonder foxtail millet. The millet, of course, the White Wonder down there was just a single cutting because it does not regrow very well, but it did produce quite nicely. The teff and crabgrass has regrowth after cutting, so we were able to do up to 3 harvests. The first 2 harvests, though, were the primary ones that provided most of the yield. But with that, you can see with the teff and crabgrass, we were over 5 tons per acre production from them. Another time period we could be thinking about for some annual forages is those or that when it is seeded in summer or late summer, and we're specifically looking for fall or winter forage. And for this, some of those spring small grain cereals I think fit really well, as well as, of course, things like turnips or other brassicas, the oilseed radishes, some of those things you might find in your typical cover crop mixtures. Planting dates for those generally late July through August. Here's some data from some plot trials showing some different small grain planted on August 13th and then harvested at the end of October. And again, with those, we had some spring triticale and oat, a couple of different oats varieties, barley, a spring wheat. And you can see we were at 3 to almost 4.5 tons per acre by the end of October on those mid-August planted small grains. Some cover crops certainly can fit in this type of situation as well. Here's a photo of a mixture or a forage cocktail planted into wheat stubble or wheat residue. This particular one had some lentils, peas, oilseed radishes, turnips, soybeans, and on the right, a sorghum. One of the things I've noticed with some of these, it is a little bit difficult to get the right mixture or proportion of the different species in there. Oftentimes, what I've noticed is a tendency for some of the taller growing things, like in this case, the sorghum, to tend to dominate and a lot of times crowd out some of these other less competitive species within that mixture. Productivity from those can also be quite good. This is an oats and turnip mixture. Photo taken on November 1st, but in this case here, the producer reported getting about 2.4 AUMs per acre from this oats and turnip mixture. Typically, these cool season annuals growing in the fall, they slowly freeze down. It does take some pretty cold temperatures, like in that 15-degree neighborhood, to really freeze them to the point where they lose their green color and basically begin to turn brown and finish up for the year. However, I've seen in cases where even after a freeze down and appears the plants have collapsed, turned tan and yellow in color, the quality of them is still quite good, and it does remain for a period of time after they are completely frozen. So as far as some of the things, we've also did some trials with where we're looking at mixing both winter and non-winter hardy cool season species. That would be things such as a mixture of winter rye and oats, rye and turnips, winter triticale and a spring triticale, and so on. And these would be late summer planted. And the idea with this is that with a late summer planting of rye and oats, for example, we know we're going to have a pretty good production from the oats in that fall of the year. The oats will, of course, not overwinter, but then we'll have some of the rye in there that will take off the following spring. So getting both fall and spring with one seeding operation. Basically, again, this was our question, and here's a photo in late September of of a rye and turnip mixture, and you can see that turnip's doing quite well, and the rye is in there, actually doing fairly well. But again, the primary objective here, getting more fall grazing and having that overwintering species, in this case the rye, to produce us some forage the following spring. Here's a mixture of the rye and oats. And planting date on some of these is very important. And this photo here illustrates the plots in the background were a September 21st planting. This is an early October photo, but the bottom part of the photo has planting done of the same thing on August 13th. And so that's a little more than a month earlier planting, but you can see certainly makes a big difference in the amount of fall growth and production that we can have. So in general, we like to say that to get significant fall forage, try to get those cool season annuals planted by September 1st, plus or minus a few days. And so it's just the earlier, the better. For the warm season annuals, things like the Sudan grass or pearl millet, we've done trials where we were planting into, to that early part of August, and we're pleasantly surprised that we could still produce significant fall forage from these. They do grow very rapidly after planting with those warm temperatures. Grazing the annual forages sometimes become a little bit tricky, particularly the taller growing ones. In this case here, some sorghum Sudan grass hybrid. In the photo here, we notice that the leaves have been grazed and stripped off pretty well, but there is also a fair amount of trampling on the ground there or waste. So it's very important to certainly start at the appropriate stage or height for some of these different tall growing summer annuals, such as the, say, a sorghum Sudan grass hybrid, where once we have some of that field reaching 18 to 24 inches in height, we really probably should be out there starting our grazing. For some of the cool seasons, say some spring planted oats, waiting until that oats reaches about 6 inches in height. And typically if we did a spring planting, that's going to be happening about the third week of May, but we want to be ready to go, because after it reaches that initial 6 inches, it seems to start growing really fast towards the end of May and into June. Now, double cropping these cool and warm season annuals is a good way to really capitalize on producing a lot of forage. If we look at the charts here, we can show on the top, roughly in shaded in green, is when a spring planted cool season annual would be having its maximum growth and production. The middle graph has a late May planted warm season annual, and then the bottom graph has another case where we might have some cool season annuals planted again in midsummer, say late July, and then shows their productivity phase or period into the fall. So knowing this, we can put together some different options using combinations of cool and warm season forages in different fields. So in the example here on field number 1, we could have a spring planted cool season forage, so a late March, early April planting. Could be something like oats or oats and field peas. That would be ready for grazing in late May to early July. Right after that oats mixture was grazed out, we could come back in later July and plant another cool season. It could be the same thing, but this would be for fall forage. In another field, we could have planted it to a warm season annual in late May, say Sudan grass. That would typically be ready for grazing in early July or so, having 2 to 3 months of grazing of it. And then after that warm season annual is grazed out, we could plant a winter annual for the following spring. So the idea with this is that we kind of have a continuous supply of grazable forage. This other field here is also an option. We could have another field that has a cool season, spring planted cool season forage that could be grazed, very similar to the first field, or it could be hayed in the latter part of June. Right after that is grazed out or hayed off. We could have plant a warm season annual forage, which could be stockpiled or just let grow. And then after frost, well into the late fall, it could be directly grazed then. It could even also be windrowed in the latter part of the year, and those windrows directly grazed in the fall and winter months. Another example here just shows two different fields, but in field one, we could be dealing with something like rye that was planted the previous fall. It's ready for grazing in April and May. After it's grazed out, a warm season annual, say pearl millet or something, is planted. And that would provide a period of summer grazing. Then could go right back into another winter annual after that warm season was grazed out. In another field, we could have a spring planted cool season forage, which we would graze after the rye is grazed out, so primarily late May into early July. After it's grazed out, come back with the same type of cool season mixture for fall grazing. So just a few examples of giving some different possibilities or combinations over a couple, 2 or 3 different fields to have that more uninterrupted supply of growing and grazable forage. Important question some people ask is, when they have some of these annuals, what can the stocking rate or carry capacity be? We've got some estimates here on these tables. So, and this would be for an early spring planted cool season annual like oats, spring Triticale, or so on and so on. And we base this off of a potential hay yield. And in most cases, with a good spring planted annual forage, we could be looking at 3.5 tons of hay production from it. So translating this into grazing, what that means is roughly 4.5 AUMs per acre, or if we graze for a month and a half, so that would be that late May to early July time period, 6 weeks or so, that means about 2 cow-calf per acre is what it would support for that month and a half time period. Thank you.